Dative, integrative and preventive healthcare. The content discussed in this episode is for informative purposes only
and should not be replaced by individualized professional consultations or professional medical advice.
Hey guys, I'm Tasha.
Hey listeners, this is Goonie, and we're here to discuss lifestyle medicine.
So we often hear references to women having a natural instinct to have kids, like maternal instinct. And people usually say it's like a biological instinct to want children. Tasha, do you relate to that feeling or to that instinct? Do you think it's a thing?
It's a tricky one. So I've had people tell me that I'm clearly having it because I'm in awe of babies. But as I've tried to understand myself better, I think it was just like a sexual drive, like an urge to just want to procreate, but actually it's just to actually have sex. What about you, Gertie?
I don't know. When I'm around children, I do feel very motherly, and so I do kind of equate that to an instinct. But I did some research, and turns out there's no real evidence to support that the notion of that there is a biological process that creates a deep longing for children, and then actually that's the same thing for men. There's no real evidence linking a biology to the creation of a parental desire.
Right.
So as you realize that, there's that yearning for parenthood, I'd like to kind of look like deeper on this question today on why we think we want children and to figure out how much it comes from like external conditioning.
Yeah, I think it's a valid point because like what I was telling you earlier, like the urge was maybe more sexual for me rather than to be a parent, but you get the wires in your mind crossed thinking that you want to have a baby because it's an instinct and you have the motherly instincts within you, or like a parental instinct, right? And I guess ideally it would be good to speak to someone who is in this space, who can actually give insight because they work with people in this space, right? And the first person we want to bring onto the show today and help us unpack these questions and the confusion around it would be a surrogacy expert, Keely, who is the founder of Collective Surrogacy, a Midwest-based surrogacy agency, and a surrogacy coach who assists parents. And she's also an attorney specializing in the area of third-party family formation. And then on the other side of it, we also want to bring in people who actually living the experience, who went through the process of surrogacy and trying to put forward the desire of wanting to be a parent in a real context. So we have a couple, Kirk and Khaleel, who resides in Miami, Florida, and they became parents via surrogacy. So welcome, Keely, Kirk, and Khaleel to Dot the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thanks a lot. We appreciate it.
So before we start talking about surrogacy, there must have been a discussion on having a baby, having a child. And so my first question goes to Khaleel and Kirk. Before consulting, anyone, what were the conversations that you guys had before even starting the process or deciding to become parents?
I always wanted to have kids. I would have done it much sooner. Just always had great joy around and with them, and was always excited of the idea. Kirk perhaps was not so inclined to start with. So I was ready 7 years before we even thought about doing the actual journey we went on. I'm very impatient. And so I was like, let's go. What are we waiting for? We can do this. This is a thing. And Kirk was very much, much more conservative. Really wanted to make sure that we were financially in a good place, and that, also had lots of questions about, should we even be parents? What does parenting entail? For me, it was like, let's go. Anyway,
That's always been him.
I like to say this about the two of us. If we were jumping off a cliff, I would jump off the cliff first, and I would discover how to save myself while I was falling. And Kirk would still be on the cliff with like a sextant, measuring the barometric pressure and looking at the angle and building doing research about how to jump. Somewhere in the middle is where the magic happens, right? But if we were left to our own devices, we would perhaps one would never make a move, and one would have jumped too soon. So I think our journey is apt because it reflects where we've sort of found our middle ground to become parents.
I agree.
Or another way to say it is that Khaleel bullied Kirk into this.
Yeah, you could say that, I guess. I was gonna say, like, I think I'm like Kirk here because I'm like, let's plan ahead and wait it out a little bit.
No, it's true. I mean, he does like to move forward quickly with things. And I think he was much more sure about it than I was. I was less sure. The thoughts about, can we do this? Do we have enough money? Do we have enough space? We're always joking back and forth, but I always call this house that we live in, I call it tiny house living. And I was wondering, we're gonna have kids in a tiny house living situation. It's like a place that's not that many square feet. But it turns out that those things aren't really important. And it also turns out that when you don't have children, and I think Keely may speak to this, and you're looking at it from the outside, you do spend a lot of time wondering if you're, I guess, the right person for the job, if this is something that you can do. Maybe not so much that you want to do, but you think, can I do it? And I think for me, learning not to pay too much attention to that and to try and ignore those kind of noises in the background and just saying, okay, let's have a little bit more Khalil in this and just go for it. It was helpful to cross that bridge and to learn how to do the things that were kind of seem scary and forbidding in terms of raising children. Also, it helps to have a short-term memory problem. So forgetting some things is good, but also not knowing too much and not overthinking it, because there's so many hidden joys along the way that you don't know that you're going to experience, and it's hard to put words to them even unless you sit down and journal and document everything. We all know what the pain points are, but finding those little gems in between, that's the thing that you don't expect is going to happen when you're looking at it from the outside. But then when you get into it, lights come on.
That makes sense, actually, like to have that caution mindset, because yeah, you are bringing a kid into the world, or you're planning to do that, so you'd want to be considering the whole picture rather than just signing up for something you're not nowhere near prepared for.
I think if we were a couple, Tasha and I would be Khalil and Tasha would be Kirk. And at some point, what you're describing, I feel, Kirk, is basically you surrendered. There must have been something about your partner as well that made you feel confident. It's like, okay, I can surrender and I can jump the cliff.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on. The one thing that I saw, and I'll never forget seeing this, but it's the look in his eyes when he was helping to take care of his nieces and nephews. So they range in age from, I think it's 17 now, down to 4 or 5.
5.
Down to 5. And so it's hard to tell you, to describe what that looks like besides joy and happiness. It's just a huge boost, because it means that you're not going to be doing the journey alone. You're not going to be raising a kid on your own. You're going to be raising it with somebody who really genuinely wants to do that. And I really think that's important. For me, that was, in addition to feeling like the finances were right and that the space was right. For me, it was important to know that he wanted it so badly. And then, of course, there's the part where you don't want to disappoint the person that you love the most. No pressure,
That's
right?
sweet.
No pressure.
That's sweet. Now I'm curious to know, like, from the agency side of things, Keely, what are the prerequisites for them to be eligible parents for surrogacy?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have certain criteria you have to look at?
Yeah, before jumping into that, I want to speak a little bit to what you guys were just talking about. From a professional perspective, seeing parents come into this process, and hearing about this, caution mindset, and when do you surrender into parenthood, and how does that play into when you begin a surrogacy process? And this is different when you're conceiving naturally versus going into a surrogacy process. When you're conceiving naturally, I think it's much easier to surrender because it can happen so quickly. You just kind of make the decision and you kind of go into it, and there's not potentially as much overthinking as Kirk was speaking to, as when you go into surrogacy. I mean, surrogacy requires a whole different level of preparation and readiness, financially, emotionally, in terms of the process itself. the one thing I can say is every single parent that comes to surrogacy has decided we want to be parents. We are ready for this. There's a very strong desire, and being prepared for the surrogacy journey versus being prepared for parenthood, are a little bit of different things, right? And so these conversations that Kirk and Khaleel had around finances and space, everyone's talking about those kind of things, hopefully, before deciding to go into parenthood together. But being ready for a surrogacy journey is a whole other level, and that kind of brings us to this eligibility or prerequisites question. So when you come to surrogacy, typically one of the first requirements is that there's some need for using a surrogate or working with a surrogate, whether that, typically is some physiological need. When we have two men, of course, we need a surrogate to conceive, or for women, some type of physiological thing that's preventing them from carrying a pregnancy safely. So that's one of the first things coming to surrogacy. Some people will pursue surrogacy for convenience, is what it's called, because they prefer not to be pregnant. But generally, ethically, that's not accepted by most professionals. When we're involving a third party, we really want to see that there's a need, to build your family in this way.
How do you tell the difference?
Yeah, so in general, we rely on medical recommendations, whether it's from, their personal physician or the fertility clinic. I mean, fertility clinics are a major component of this process, of course. They're the ones who are doing those early medical assessments, determining who is medically needing to go through this process, creating the embryos that are ultimately used to conceive with a surrogate. And so they make a lot of these determinations, but there's certainly a lot of gray area. There might be a psychological component to needing a surrogate, whether that is kind of the trauma of past pregnancy losses, whether it is, a phobia of some sort. And those are certainly reasonable bases for pursuing surrogacy when you have that desire to parent, but there's something preventing you from accomplishing that naturally. We certainly want there to be space for anyone who needs to build their family in this way to be able to do so.
That makes sense. But that would be very tricky to evaluate that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and really a big part of this too in surrogacy is that this is a open, relational, and transparent process between parents and surrogates. And so really the surrogate also has to be the one that feels comfortable engaging in this process with the intended parents based on their stated need and history. And surrogates have self-determination in the journey in that way, which is very important. When we get past that kind of medical basis, as Kirk and Khaleel were talking about, there's financial affordability, of course. There's inherent costs with surrogacy that just can't be avoided, particularly with US surrogacy. You have surrogate costs, you have legal expenses, you have insurance expenses, medical expenses, of course, and these add up quickly. Fortunately, as time goes on, there are more resources available to support families who need financial assistance to access this process, which is a really wonderful component of our professional space in allowing, again, as many families who need surrogacy to, realize that dream of parenthood, as I think most parents pursuing surrogacy would describe. So affordability is a big issue. And
so how much are we talking about, like in terms of figures?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it ranges depending on how, what your particular journey looks like. But when you use all of the typical components and professionals, a surrogacy agency, a fertility clinic, you're doing IVF in a standard process, an average cost currently is probably $150,000. To scale back on that, sometimes parents have family or friends that are willing to do this for them. and there are other ways to kind of save here and there. But even in a process with, maximum savings in the US, it's very hard to do this process for less than, $75 to $100,000 in a best case scenario. So it's expensive.
Wow, that's insane. That's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
This makes me think of the episodes in Friends where Phoebe decides to be the surrogate for her brother, and they have like triplets.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just imagining like the cost of that would be insane.
Mm-hmm. Raising triplets, not to mention the cost of that.
Yeah, that's another story altogether.
Yeah.
It gets quite expensive.
So
I,
I guess you as the planner, Kirk, seeing that this was a figure that was coming your way, how, even mentally speaking, emotionally speaking, when you see that this is the cost, you have your counterparts that are maybe heterosexual, and for them, like it's free to get to that point. How do you feel? Like how is that process going through? How do you process that?
well, Khalil has a phrase when he describes what it costs for a heterosexual couple, or his brother, for example.
I like to say, what took him 6 minutes took us six figures.
Wow. Your poor brother is just like carrying the weight for all heterosexual people.
No, but let it sink in. It's true. Like when you think about it. And I think that's why it's so interesting to have this couple and Keely on this episode, is because they really wanted to be a parent. Now, this doesn't undermine heterosexual couples. This is not what I'm saying, is that as they started in this process, they really wanted to be parents. So the crisis of, do you want to become a parent? Is it an instinct or not? Like it does come to a point where you actually have to ask yourself, do I really want this? And why? What are the reasons that I really want this? So sorry, Keely, we've been going on and off, and you were explaining kind of the financial affordability. What are other things that you look at for parents?
Those really are the two main things, is kind of a need and affordability, in addition to a willingness to go through what is a very rigorous, long, complicated process that is not void of risk. You need to really, really want it. And whether, to the point of this conversation, that's a intrinsic biological motivation or extrinsic, or whatever the reason is you're coming to it, these people want to be parents, and they are willing to make sacrifices in their life to do that over a long period of time without even a guarantee that they're going to get a baby and the end of it. There are components outside of people's control that are going to impact, that outcome. Overall, surrogacy is a highly successful, very controllable family building process. But of course, Mother Nature is always there. So
more on an ethical side, can anyone, like, say, criminals, say, or there are people who are doing this with malicious intent that you can't grasp in the assessment because they aced it, or psychological assessment, but they actually have. How do you deal with these guys? Like, how do you catch them?
So what we're talking about at a higher level is what assessments are fair to put intended parents through to make sure that they're doing this, I guess, quote unquote, for the right reasons, or are they going to be good parents? Is that a question that we can even ask? And I think in general, in the surrogacy space, our mindset is for those people that naturally conceive, they don't need to go through any of that. And why is it then fair that we put them through that just because someone needs to build their family through surrogacy? And so there is this kind of hesitation to do those types of assessments just because someone may happen to need to, use a surrogate to have a child. With that said, we of course do have another person involved here. We have a woman who's volunteering to be a surrogate for another family, and it's only fair to her that she knows the background of the intended parent family that she's helping, just as the intended parent family knows the surrogate's background. And the surrogate goes through psychological evaluation and background checks and has to divulge a lot of sensitive information about herself as these parents are assessing, can I trust and feel comfortable with this woman, taking care of the most precious thing in our life? The surrogate really is deserving of similar information about the intended parents for her to make the decision that this is a family that she wants to help. So would it matter if someone had a criminal history? Would it matter if they have, a mental health condition? Not necessarily. If there's full transparency and the surrogate is willing to help this intended family. Are there limits to that? Of course. But we work in a space where a lot of this is subjective and will be based on what the professionals are requiring in terms of background checks. Every agency does this a little bit differently. And what the surrogate, is requiring, in terms of information to choose a particular family to help. So there's not a clear answer, but in general, with surrogacy, we don't want there to be significant barriers or assessments of, are you going to be a good parent, or how are you going to parent? That doesn't necessarily feel right just because someone needs a surrogate to have a child.
Yeah, good you read my mind, because the first thought that came to my mind was, what about people who might be abusers or predators? You never know. But
also the thing is that if the person is an abuser, I think that this process would be a bit too tiresome. But maybe a question to the couple, to Kirk and Khaleel, why surrogacy instead of adoption?
We had a lot of conversations, also with other couples who have, gay couples who have children, including whether they did adoption or surrogacy. And I think one of the things that they experienced was, with adoptions, normally the type of children who go up for adoption or go through foster systems usually have lots of challenges. And so you are taking on children who have entered into a foster care system or need to be adopted because of circumstances, and you really often don't know what those are. You also don't know what type of mental or psychological challenges these children have. And so you're trying to build a safe environment for them. And you're trying to also diagnose what could have happened before they got to you. And the other piece of it, especially when it comes to the fostering side, is you also never know when they might come back and say, well, circumstances have changed, and now this is no longer going to be a working arrangement. And so, you think about all those things, and think about when you do surrogacy, aside from the fact that the child has some genetic linkage to you, if you happen to be one of the either the egg or the embryo that is part of the genetic linkage, the child is yours. Like, when the child is born, all throughout the legal process, when that child is brought into this world, it is your child. It's not someone else's child. And I have to say, I give great respect, because I'm thinking about the many conversations I had, and also the privilege that Kirk and I have, because for a generation of men that didn't have surrogacy as an option, adoption and fostering was the route to becoming parents. And so it's a yes and, right? There's different ways in which you can now become parents. This one is a bit more secure for us. No one can come to our door and say that the child that we have is no longer our child. And that was really, really important to us to be able to sort of navigate what that is.
So being a gay couple, would that kind of impact your chances of being eligible to be adoptive parents?
I think it depends on the organization, and it depends on the climate of the organization. We have certainly seen instances and news stories where gay couples have been turned away, or they're not eligible, depending on the agency that they're speaking to, whether because of religious reasons or because of state political reasons. We didn't go down that far in our own journey. As we were assessing, we were like, very quickly came to the fact that surrogacy was going to be our path forward.
right. And Keely, like on your end, as an agency, like, do you see kind of the reasons why people choose surrogacy over adoption?
Well, first I'll say it's not always an or. Right now, I have a gay couple from the East Coast who just adopted a 4-year-old little boy. And also today, I think we're going to find out that their surrogate is pregnant with their first child. So there are families who will pursue both. But adoption is much less predictable. It is a challenging process to go through emotionally. These children, of course, all deserve loving homes, but to Khalil's point, you don't have control over the pregnancy conditions. You don't fully know the background. And I think for many people, that's very challenging, going into parenthood, especially for the first time, with those added layers. But really, it comes down to genetic components. When people pursue surrogacy, generally it's because it's a way to have a genetic child. And so whatever that biological component may or may not be, or how that mindset is developed, that's a whole other question. But genetics is certainly a big reason why people come to surrogacy versus adoption. Control. You are choosing the woman that's going to carry this pregnancy. You have a lot of information about her. You are choosing the genetic components if there is a donor involved. So it is a highly predictable process versus adoption. And then safeguards. You have legal contracts, you have testing options going into pregnancy and throughout pregnancy. You're able to be involved in the pregnancy, attend appointments, know how the baby's developing, experience the pregnancy really as if it were your own, through the relationship with the surrogate, which is typically very open between parents and surrogates. So it's a whole different experience and process that parents get to go through, I think, with just a different level of assuredness as to the health of the pregnancy and the baby. But on the other side, certainly there is a crisis of children that need to be adopted into happy homes. People will choose adoption for that reason. And adoption is a lot cheaper. It's a more affordable option than surrogacy. So there are pros and cons on each side. And, it's not always an easy choice for parents.
What I wanted to say is that I've had a number of conversations with other gay couples, and two stories come to mind. One is when I was in grad school, one of my classmates shared his and his husband's journey to adoption. And their two boys are from the Ukraine and Latin American country, and they have a beautiful family. And the boys well, they were preteens. They're probably college age now, since that was 10 years ago. But he shared the story of going to Ukraine, and normally two parents go, and the limit is like whatever the down payment is whatever you can take across the border. And but because they were a gay couple and they couldn't say that they were a gay couple, he was adopting as a single person for the purpose of adopting. When he got to the border, he had twice the amount of money. He had to bribe the immigration agent to let him into the country with twice the amount of money that would normally be allowed, in order to be able to pick up the son that they were adopting. And it just goes to show, like, different journeys are different pathways. The second story that I have is a friend of mine from college, and he and his husband cannot afford surrogacy. We've had many conversations, and they had a child that they were paired with earlier last year, and the child was with them for about 6 months, and behavioral issues weren't diagnosed by the agency. But my friend astutely figured out the real challenges the child had. And once they realized what those issues were, it was more than what they could handle. That the child needed the appropriate support. And so in doing the good work, actually undid his ability to be a home for this child, because the child needed the right services.
Yeah.
But today they're fostering two children, and they're just enjoying every minute of it, and it looks like they'll be able to adopt those two. And so there are multiple pathways. right? That many people can go through, and they all have different journeys that you go through to get there. I mean, we fully recognize that there is a privilege in being able to go down the surrogacy path. One, because it's financial, and two, because of, as Keely so really eloquently said, there's a lot of peace of mind, right? You invest a lot when you bring another child into your sphere and try and make a home for them, and there's many pathways that can fall apart.
I I hear you. I think that the genetical like resemblance, seeing your child that looks like you, I think that component also it's maybe a superficial thing. But I think that that's a valid point as well. And I think that's where we can go into the conversation about when you start the process, the genetic contributors, be it the egg donor, the surrogate, that there's a conversation to it. For my question to you, Khalil and Kirk, what was the selection criteria that you had in mind when you started the process?
Okay, go ahead. I know you're gonna say it. Go ahead. It's
So
all right.
we assigned each other veto power over any selection.
Love
And
it.
so you get this, it's almost like a printed out Tinder, list of like, here are the potential people you could go look at. And so what we did, this was me being optimistic. I was like, let's each go independently and let's choose 5 potential candidates and let's come back and let's see. And of course, I was like, oh, we will align at least 3 of the 5. We could not have been more further apart in the selection of what our egg donor would look like, because of just different values. And it was like 3 months. We'd be like, let's do it again. And then you're like, oh, maybe it's the wrong pool. So let's go and ask other agencies if we can tap into their pool and see what their portfolio looks like. And it was like veto, 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 veto. And then on this side, he was like veto, veto, absolutely not, veto, veto. And so we sort of had to be like, okay, what are we doing wrong? Because this is not going to work. And so we really had to ask ourselves, and I guess this is, perhaps a very different series of questions than others normally have to do, which is like, what are the values of what you want in a person? And I would also say that, Kirk and I come from different backgrounds, right? I'm of Indian descent. Kirk is of Caucasian descent.
I'm not sure if you can tell that or not. I don't really think that's really the
And so
Yeah.
there's clearly a big color variation. But to Gooni's point about genetic like linkage, our journey was that we did the same egg donor for both of us, and we have half embryos that are mine and half embryos that are genetically Kirk's. So we have 2 daughters. One is genetically mine, but is our daughter, and one is genetically Kirk's and is our daughter. So they have a shared genetic linkage, which is their egg donor, their mom. But in terms of how they look, they look a little bit different, right? Because there's a difference in the color.
I cannot imagine life without Kaya, and she may not look anything like me. Lucky for her. She's so lucky. If you step back and think about this, first of all, I can't imagine my life without her. That's number one. That's how close we are. I mean, we are over at the TV singing songs from Frozen. I do Anna's
That's
part.
so
She does.
sweet.
So we're just close. I mean, if you think about it, I'm genetically not related to her at all. So I could be a foster parent, adoptive parent, or just anybody, technically speaking. But when you get into the family unit, when you build a family unit, all of those things go out the window. So you can understand why people who adopt somebody don't think twice about calling the boy or the girl their son or their daughter, because they really are. That's the bond that you build. It's not based on blood or genetics. It's based on shared experiences.
I really like that it's based on shared experiences because it really takes away the barrier of everything genetic,
Right, right,
scientific,
right. All those things go by the wayside, especially after seeing Frozen 1. I'm telling you.
Kaya knows us as her parents. And so does
Yeah.
Cora, our youngest. And so we are their unit. And that'll be their journey.
And we wouldn't have it any other way.
How long did that take you to kind of map that out
It
before
was a
you?
bunch of weeks. And of course, I was impatient. I was like, we have to make a decision. This is taking too long. This is a roadblock getting to the next stage.
And I don't have all the boxes checked. So we one right down there at the bottom. We can't agree on that one. So let's work it there.
I mean, Kirk's version of this was that he wanted Gal Gadot. And so I was like, look,
What?
Gal Gadot.
Okay, so that's another part of the learning process, right? Which is you're learning about yourself and what you value, as well as what your partner values. So, and I think you have to migrate past, you want the movie star looks or the movie star height, and you want the maybe or maybe not, or maybe you want the the intelligence quotient, you want the highest IQ value.
Well, that's not where he started, I can tell you that.
No, I didn't say.
That was you were so quick to jump on that.
No, yeah.
But that's where I started. And he was like, why are we looking at these profiles? They're not, anyway.
So you end up coming to this a happy medium.
Kind of to relate it back to women who choose their, men. You do look at those things, like thinking about this, like the physical side, basically Khaleel alluding to is that like a bit of superficial side where you're looking, but women do look at this, but you also want the brains and of that, but it's difficult to judge. So I think you had like an additional like set of information and to be able to with your surrogate. Usually your man sometimes it's just later that you find out that he's a bit of an idiot. So
I mean, I have to say, you really do get this really great profile. It's like, here's their family history, this is their parents, this is their grandparents, this is what their family has had in terms of health challenges. And you're like, like, I mean, to your point, Guni, imagine if Tinder profiles came with that extra layer.
Tell me about this, please.
Yes, I want
another
that.
episode.
I want that.
For us, it was overwhelming.
Yeah, it really was.
And so we aligned, as we often do, the cliff. So somewhere in the middle is where we landed.
Yeah.
But for me, my initial part going in was, are they curious people, and does their profile show that they've been good people? And so what have been their journeys? And so you read these responses to their essays, and some are very flippant, and some you can tell took the time to really tell a story and to talk about why they wanted to be egg donors and what their personal growth and journey has been. And so the person that we chose was someone who had worked as a social worker, did a lot in advancing their education, was also fairly tall and stunning. Like, I think we really lucked out. And as Kirk likes to say, both of our girls got the better end of the deal when it comes to the genetic jackpot.
Love it.
Yeah, it wasn't that also that we completely disregarded race or complexion or color because we didn't, because one thing we want to be cognizant of, we had to be cognizant of, I should say, is today's society. So I don't know if I'm a control freak. Did you say I'm a control freak?
Yes.
Okay. We'll talk about that later. So one thing that I hear and I read, and we've all seen it, a lot of racial profiling, and the last in police work, but also in society in general. And I think the last thing that I wanted to put Khaleel through was a situation where, with this complexion, that he walked into a supermarket someplace, and the child that he was with would cause some kind of consternation in some bystander or some store employee or some cop on the beat who got full of themselves before they went on shift or whatever, where he would have to explain himself, or where he felt that he would have to provide some kind of extraordinary proof that he was the genetic father or the father of the child. Now, in retrospect, that's probably that's taking worry to a pretty highly extreme level, but it was something we did think about. So I think that women who were on one side or the other side of the equation, in terms of complexion, probably didn't really make it into the final group that we chose from. It was in our minds. It was in the back of our minds. Certainly that would be something that he would have to deal with, and something he might have to consider. And I didn't want that. But now the hilarious thing is, of course, Cora is least this tone. When Khaleel does go someplace, he's going to be going with a little girl
Yeah.
who's quite Caucasianish.
I mean, rightfully so, though, because it is your current environment that you're living in, right? So I think it's a valid thing to consider and be conscious of, because it would be something that affects your daily life.
And to add on, like if it's a woman that has, a mixed child, and usually they will say she's the help or she's the nanny, or there's always like things like that happens, and then it questions the eligibility or the legitimacy of her being the parent and the mother, and that these are kind of uncomfortable situations to deal with. So it's understandable that this is a criteria that you look at.
Yeah. And I know we're talking about this all lightly now, and it's done, and you're in the good side of things now. But at that time when you guys were in that process, right, and you were discussing your values, etc., was there like a real strain on your relationship because of this process?
Oh, I definitely think it was a challenge for both of us because we had to confront what we each wanted out of this process and find a way to jointly come up with what we wanted out of this process. I think if it had been up to each of us individually, we would have gone on a different path. And so having to really sit down, I mean, let me tell you the amount of vetoes that got pushed through. It's, I was like, are we looking at the same list? How did you even find these 5 people? Like, I mean, it was that level of a conversation. Names.
No, it would no. He's being too kind. What are you thinking is more like it. If you're a couple, what are you thinking? What are you thinking?
And we
So,
both had to make
but
cases.
yeah, I mean, and what it does is it sharpens the sword in a sense in terms of your value selection. You make better choices because of your partner and your partner's input, instead of worse choices that you probably make individually. So that's but the most important part is sharpening your perception and your understanding of the values that you have, not and that you want in your children, and that's probably the most valuable part that comes out of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I guess over to you now, Keely, on the side of like choosing a surrogate to be in your panel of surrogate mothers, right? What's that process like, and the requirements that you guys look at?
So in terms of how surrogates are qualified, it is a lengthy and rigorous process. There's an education component, just as for intended parents. Surrogacy is an intensive process, requires injection medications and travel to the clinic and contracts and paperwork and a lot of intensive steps. So we need to make sure that any surrogate is fully prepared for and up for that process. In addition, of course, medically, surrogates need to be healthy to carry pregnancy. They need to have a child of their own. They need to have a healthy pregnancy and delivery history. They need to be within the medically recommended age range, which is around 21 to early 40s. They need to be mentally healthy, of course, for the process. There's a psychological evaluation that assesses that, in addition to assessing the spouse or partner's support of the process. Any surrogate needs to have a really solid support system, both from a spouse partner if they are partnered, or from other supports from family and friends if they don't. And they go through background checks just like the intended parents do. And so it's a multi-step process, and at the end of that, we have the medical team that's assessed medical records and made sure she's healthy to carry pregnancy. We have the psychologist who's done the assessment of the mental health component, we've done the background checks and the education component, and we have, this very comprehensive profile of information that's then ready to be shared with parents. And then it goes over to the assessment of, is this the right match for parents? And whereas Kirk and Cleo are talking about the genetic component of an egg donor, the variables that determine whether this is a surrogate is the right match for parents are different. The genetics, of course, don't play into that side of it. It's really, will this woman be able to healthily carry our child? Do we have the same hopes and expectations about what the relationship between us will look like through this journey? Is she comfortable with us being involved in appointments? Do we want to communicate with each other with the same frequency? How are we going to navigate pregnancy decisions together is a really, really important component. This is the surrogate's body, but the intended parent's child. So that's certainly a tricky and interesting dynamic that needs to be discussed in detail, and everyone needs to be aligned with who's making decisions about those components throughout the pregnancy. In addition, there are financial components based on, will her medical insurance policy cover the pregnancy? What expenses are we going to need to cover? Going into a surrogacy, of course, we want to make sure these women have no loss financially as a result of being a surrogate. So the parents are responsible, liable for any expense that comes out of the surrogacy. So that financial assessment is certainly a part of that compatibility assessment. And there are legal, components as well. Surrogacy laws and parentage laws work differently in every state. So depending on where the surrogate lives and the parents live, the legal assessment needs to happen as well to make sure that the parents have a predictable, clear path to being the parents of this child, either before baby's born or very shortly after. And so those are kind of a whole different set of components that they have to look at, that with a good agency, is doing all that vetting and assessment alongside the parents and the surrogate to make sure that this is a good match and will result in a happy and successful process between the parties.
Yeah, it's interesting that, so the criteria for surrogate is really like you're looking at a relationship, and there's a stronger bond and communication with regards to those, whereas the egg donor not so much. As an agency, what are kind of the criteria for you to select a healthy egg donor?
So with a donor, we're looking at really their ability to create healthy eggs that give the parents a high chance of success at creating healthy embryos and a healthy child. So it's the age range is different between an egg donor surrogate. Egg donors typically, ideally, are under the age of 30. And there's the genetic assessment component. There's very intensive genetic testing that's done to identify if they're at higher risk for passing certain genetic traits on to the child. So we're looking at what is her ability to produce healthy eggs, and what is her ability to create healthy embryos that, again, will result in a healthy child. So there is the genetic assessment component that's done. Whereas with the surrogate, it really is, what is her ability to healthily gestate a pregnancy? In addition to, does she have a healthy lifestyle support system and an ability to healthily go through this process in partnership with these intended parents? And there's a huge relationship component to that. Whereas with the egg donor, that's not always a part of the picture, but that's a huge question. And Kirk and Cleo can speak to that as well if they would like, is, some parents really want to have a relationship and know their egg donor. Some do not. Donors will also have opinions about whether they'd like to be known or anonymous. But certainly there is a trend these days at being more open with that relationship, really for the benefit of the child in the future, to potentially know who that person is and kind of have that piece of the puzzle of their origin story. So there is that relationship conversation and dynamic to both choices, with the surrogate match and the donor match, just in different ways.
Yes. So because Keely and Cleo and myself are so immersed in the world of of how this works, for
Mhm.
intended parents such as ourselves. It maybe just bears mentioning that the egg donor is a separate person from the surrogate in our particular cases. Just wanted to clarify that in case that wasn't absolutely clear. So we selected our egg donor from a database that was associated with the IVF clinic that we selected for embryo creation and then later implantation. So the egg donor is a completely different person than the surrogate. The surrogate is the woman who will carry our embryos to term and deliver the baby. So in our case, anyway, they're not the same person. I'm not sure if there is such a thing as a same person, egg donor / surrogate.
There
maybe.
is. You hear lots of stories of sometimes it's a cousin or a sister who helps carry a surrogate baby, for lack of a better term, for their brother or a family member or someone else, and so they might both be the genetic uh, egg donor and also the person who carries the baby to term as well.
But let me ask Keely, is that a thing that happens in agency work, generally speaking?
So it used to happen more frequently. It does not happen as frequently anymore, but I have been involved in those types of cases. And usually it's between parties that have a known relationship with each other. Obviously, it's a different, for many women, it would be a different psychological undertaking to be a surrogate and also have her genetics used. But there are certainly women that can separate that. And they say, if I can be an egg donor for a family and I could be a surrogate for a family, why can't I be both of those at the same time if I'm willing to do each separately? And so it really does come down just to that psychological component and assessment of suitability. But the legal risk for parents, if a surrogate's genetically related to the baby, is a whole different ballgame. That genetic component tends to have a big effect on the legal safeguards of the process for intended parents if a surrogate were to change her mind, which happens very, very, very rarely. I want to make clear, when you're using the right professionals and doing this process correctly, that risk really doesn't enter into the equation. But when you do what's called traditional surrogacy, where the surrogate is also the egg contributor and the genetic, parent, for lack of a better word, of the child, it's a different, it's a whole different process. But that is a much less expensive way to pursue surrogacy for intended parents, because you don't have the IVF medical component. And so there are many couples that will pursue traditional surrogacy with a family member or friend. Obviously not if they're of the same genetic pool. But they will do it that way in order to still achieve that genetic relationship, whether it's a same-sex male couple pursuing traditional surrogacy with a friend, they have that same genetic component, while also having the safeguards of surrogacy at a lower cost. So it happens. Not as much in the agency space. Usually these are people doing the process independently. And we just hope in those cases as professionals that they're accessing the safeguards that they should be, with meeting with a psychologist, having a contract, going through the right legal steps. And unfortunately they don't always, but they should.
Yeah, I'm guessing that there's a lot. They were doing this. They're doing a version of surrogacy on the cheap, if you will, I would say. Not all of them, but for not having the legal safeguards in place would be just unthinkable, I think, for most folks who seriously want to have a baby via this process, just because it is fraught with a lot of, I'm sure, emotional challenges for a woman who'd be an egg donor as well as a surrogate. I can't imagine how hard it would be to separate yourself from that child voluntarily when you know that he or she, the boy or girl, shares your genetics.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me to the question, like at post delivery, even if you are in this process of, you have this agency that is helping the process and that is facilitating, didn't you have any challenges or the like questions or problem that surfaced at delivery time? Did you fear that, something might happen? How did that process go for you?
So I'll say two things. One, the agency does a masterful job in really making sure that who you're paired with aligns with the values of what you have, because you're really almost entering into a lifelong relationship of some kind, because this person is giving up their time, their agency, and their body for us to become parents. And if that relationship isn't really strong, then it can be damaging to both sides. And so we never viewed a surrogate as an oven, for lack of a better term. It really was gratitude that this person was willing to sacrifice their body to help us become parents. And all along the way, I mean, Keely's heard us say it every time, their decision is a priority in our decision making. So it never at any point is it like, well, we're the parents, so we decide what it is that happens in this process. It's like, right, are you comfortable with the decision we're about to make? And these are some of the questions that you're asked when you're doing with surrogate. For example, what if there's an emergency C-section? Who is in the room when the baby's being delivered? I mean, I say this all the time, like, if you need me in the parking lot because that gives you peace of mind, I will wait in the parking lot while you
To be fair, though, he wanted to be in the parking lot most times, and I wanted to be there with the catcher's mitt.
probably. But all along the way, it really was respect and gratitude that someone was willing to do this with their body and their time. And also recognizing that when we make decisions about surrogate, especially when they're hospital or health related decisions, they have a family to go back to. And so it's not just us. Like, it's respecting that they have children of their own, they have families of their own. And so along the
Schedules,
way,
time, everything.
that process is really important. Post delivery, to answer the question that you asked, is really interesting because one of the benefits of working with an agency like Keely is that the legal process is very locked in stone. So there's not that many questions about, like, well, if the baby's born, who's going to who has the rights to the baby? That's been decided from the very beginning of the process, from the time a surrogate enters into the agency, from the time we sign on as clients to the time the first contracts are made. Like, you don't get to, you're at the hospital and someone's like, wait, did we fill out this form? Like, that's not.
Oh, but they try that. They try that.
No, I mean, so when you get to the hospital, and we're a unique situation because we are a gay couple and we're intended parents. There's usually a pre-birth order that is sent to the hospital. It sort of says, hey, this is a special circumstance. Here are some things we have already discussed, which we've actually already discussed with the surrogate, who's in the room, what happens if it's a normal delivery, what happens if it's an emergency or C-section. All those things are discussed before we even step foot into the hospital. And then there's a post-birth order that really sort of says, and now it's been the baby's been delivered. For example, once the baby's delivered, the baby is with us. We generally get our own room, though that isn't often always the case.
Or we get a waiting room, or we get a
and the surrogate
partially enclosed waiting room.
Right. The surrogate who's delivered a baby is also in recovery. But the post deliveries is fairly straightforward. Very much so, recognizing it's a different process. It really is, we are now the parents once the baby's arrived, and the surrogate is someone who's delivered a baby and needs time to recover, and also is going through that recovery process as well.
Yeah, and I would just add to that the hospital staff, I mean, by and large, they are all confident professionals. But if you're dealing with a hospital stay, and when we had Cora, she had to spend a few days in the NICU. But not every individual person is completely up to speed with what surrogacy is, how it works, and those types of technical details, which lead to some sometimes funny complications and some confusion. But you have to bear in mind that if you're going into this process, you have to be on your P's and Q's, and you have to probably pretty consistently remind some staff members of who you are and why you're there, and just for the make sure that you have the requisite paperwork. Just to get
from a agency perspective and facilitating this for parents, I mean, in general, the goal is the parents are going through a very normal experience of becoming parents to that child once the baby's here, right? This is their baby. Everyone's spent a year and a half or more going through this process together to get to that moment. The surrogate wants to sleep. She's like, get yourself and this baby out of here. I'm resting. I did not sign up for sleepless nights like you did. And so that dynamic should be very normal in the way that like post-birth challenges, quote unquote, are the normal ones. It's the sleeplessness, it's getting used to bottle feeding, it's figuring out how to change diapers. There are the logistics of, will they get a room with the baby? Is there going to be space, for that, which hospitals will always accommodate. Hospitals know that these are the parents. Surrogacy is done so frequently now that there really is not hospitals that don't know, aren't well versed in surrogacy and how to do this. And so there are the steps that need to happen to make sure that everything on the logistics side and the paperwork side kind of aligns with the intent of the surrogacy that Kirk and Cleo from that first moment are parents for every intent and purpose from there forward. But it should feel like a very kind of normal entrance into the challenges of parenthood and the joys of parenthood. So
I just want to share two things. One is a quick story, and the other is just the relationship we have with our surrogates since we've had our daughters. So with our first, with Kaya, our first surrogate was in a room recovering. Fortunately, she had an emergency C-section, and we were in our own room with Kaya bonding and first-time parents. One of the things we did quite frequently was we went across the hall and would spend time with Kaya with her and her husband, really giving them the chance to see, what they helped us create, because we knew we were going home with the baby. So as much time as we could share with them would be really helpful. Unfortunately, that had an unintended consequence. We almost caused a code pink, which is when a baby's kidnapped. So we were just hanging out, the five of us, our surrogate, her husband, and our hospital. And the hospital we were in was on an island, because we're in Florida, of course, and it had two bridges. And the nurse burst in the door and she's like, "Where is the baby?" And we were like, "Right here." Like,
With that voice?
duh.
With that voice?
Yeah, she was kind of husky. Yeah, she was husky.
She had been frantically looking for us. Like we were not in our room. The baby was not in the room, and we were. We all have these bands that they do to protect. And so the next day we were like, beep, 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 beep. Hello, main station. This is, our room, and we're going to the next room. We're like, "Oh, you're that couple." We're like, "Yes, we're the ones who almost caused a code pink."
The bridge is locked down and all this other kind
Yeah,
of stuff.
so you can have some fun moments and some scary moments, because normally when a family has a baby, they just go into their room and they're in their room. But we were across two rooms, and so we were with this blended experience, and I don't think they were quite prepared for that. So that was a really funny story. There's another one we don't have time for, but I'll share it with Goonie in a separate moment. But what I did want to say is we have bonded with both of our surrogates. There's no better story. Yeah, there's no better story. On Father's Day last year, our first surrogate, her husband and their two daughters came to visit us and dropped off a gift for Kaya, and we spent the weekend spending time together. And for my birthday last year, we went to their house and we did a road trip with Kaya, and we spent the weekend really just spending time with them and bonding and being some sort of like a blended unit, whatever you want to call it. And we just had Cora all of 7 months, and same thing with our surrogate in that instance. We are text messages on a daily, weekly basis, and try and visit with them whenever we possibly can, which goes to tell you, like, it's a really, really special moment, where you are really grateful, and you become families throughout the entire process. We were in touch with each other during the pregnancy. And in certain cases, we actually visited for key moments, like when you find out the day of the gender, the first time you could get a 3D scan. Like, we were really as integrated as we could be, with their respect, like always with their permission.
And I think that what you're describing is a testament to parenting, parenthood, or even family, how you run a family or how you build a family. There's no one way to do it. It's how you, with the different members of the family, the different members of the partnership, that you create how you want it to look like, how it feel like, the relationships you make, and that I find it quite refreshing, and I hope that people can see this as also another way, an inspiration to look at their own, family systems, partnerships of what do you want to create intentionally. Because what I'm hearing most from Keely and from Khaleel and Kirk is that there's a lot of intention, and hopefully rightfully placed intention. But when it creates really beautiful stories. Tasha, anything you want to add?
No, took all the words out of my mouth. But exactly that.
Keely, Khaleel, and Kirk, anything you want to leave us with?
No, I think you really encapsulated it well, Uni, that the surrogacy is a very intentional process. And hopefully, I wish for everyone out there, they come to that moment of clarity of, is parenthood right for us or not? And if it is, that I just am grateful that we live in a day and an age where there are so many family building options available to people who come to that decision to be parents, whether it's surrogacy, adoption, natural conception, or a whole host of other ways to build your family. So just wish everybody the best out there as they navigate that.
Thank you so much for being the show.
Yes, thank you everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
If you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and select that follow or subscribe button.
Till then, stay well.